Game of Thrones defined popular culture throughout the 2010s. It was a decade-defining show, amassing 59 Emmys over its 8 seasons, a critical and audience darling. Game of Thrones was truly unmatched as the greatest show on television for most of its run, and this success was no accident. Based on George R.R. Martin's sprawling book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, the show had some incredible source material to work with and build upon. With complex characters, an intriguing story, and some of the best set design, costume work, and visual spectacle ever seen on TV, Game of Thrones really changed people's thoughts on what a TV show can be. Even though it's only been a few years since its ending, it's still hard to fathom just how huge a hit Game of Thrones was. References to the show were abound in all different types of media.
And they would never cancel Game of Thrones. It's a crossover hit. It's not just for fantasy enthusiasts. They're telling human stories in a fantasy world.
Having it referenced in songs, parodied and mentioned in other television shows, casually mentioned in live broadcasts.
I will be the front half of Daenerys Targaryen's dragon.
Okay, thank you,
It's the
Tucker.
green one.
Thank you, Tucker.
All right, thank you, my Khaleesi.
Well, as much
Everyone knew what Game of Thrones was, and everyone loved it. The marketing for the show added to the phenomenon, as they did stunts like building a statue of the despised King Joffrey so that it could be torn down and broken after a few days. They also hid various replicas of the Iron Throne all around the world as a type of scavenger hunt in the lead up to Season 8, with people lining up en masse whenever one of these thrones were found in order to have a picture of them on it. The events in the show became iconic, as the Red Wedding became the most infamous moment ever seen in television, with book readers filming the reactions of their unsuspecting friends. Instead of asking someone to hold the door for you, people would just say Hodor and get sad all over again. People got so swept up in the excitement of the show that there were tons of babies being born and named after characters in the show, with the name Khaleesi being the most popular among them, which I always found a little odd considering Khaleesi is a title rather than a name. The name aged even more poorly after the events of the final season when the namesake of so many children became a mass murderer. The point is that Game of Thrones was massive. Its success from a television standpoint, but also its presence in popular culture, was unparalleled. And then Season 8 happened. With showrunners David and Dan seemingly tired of working on Thrones, and with potential Star Wars project waiting for them, they expedited the final season, making it 6 episodes, cramming into it as much as they could. However, the massive dip in the writing quality of the show was unimaginable, as they performed character assassination on a number of characters and resolved the series in a terribly contrived and illogical way. The finale of Game of Thrones is still panned as one of the worst finales to a show ever. Fan sites that were once dedicated to the show became sites dedicated to hating the show and memeing on the terrible final season. Game of Thrones was possibly the greatest television series ever, and it ended in such a way that killed the show's rewatchability for a lot of people. The ending of Game of Thrones left a void within the cultural zeitgeist, a void that many studios saw as an opportunity. Despite its ending, it cannot be denied that in its prime, Game of Thrones was a pop culture juggernaut. Other studios decided that they wanted a piece of this action and started buying up the rights to a ton of medieval-based fantasy books. The idea of these studios was seemingly to adapt these fantasy novels into their own Game of Thrones, capitalizing on the demand for fantasy series that Game of Thrones seemingly created. For the longest time, fantasy has been seen as a niche genre that doesn't have the broad appeal to garner the interest of the masses. You would think they would have learned the potential that adapting fantasy series has after the Lord of the Rings movies came out in the early 2000s. To be fair though, there was a bit of a fantasy film arms race following the success of The Lord of the Rings in the mid-2000s, as we were graced with such films as Aragon, The Golden Compass, and the Narnia movies. These projects saw some success, but never came close to the benchmark set by The Lord of the Rings, which is seemingly what the studios were after. It feels like we have entered a similar space in the post-Game of Thrones world. There have been lazy, superficial attempts to capitalize on the surge in popularity for fantasy series like Netflix's aptly titled Cursed, but the majority of shows that are in the race to fill the void left by Game of Thrones come from well-known book series with established worlds and eager fan bases. As I see it, the current shows that have the best chance to fill the void left by Game of Thrones are Netflix's The Witcher, Amazon's The Wheel of Time and Rings of Power, and HBO's House of the Dragon. Now this isn't to say that I think any of these shows will become a cultural phenomenon the same way Game of Thrones did, but in my opinion, that says more about how huge Game of Thrones was rather than the prospective successes of these shows. Something I found kind of funny is the fact that every single one of these shows have a former Game of Thrones cast member in them, almost as an attempt to invoke some connection to Thrones. The Witcher features Tormund Giantsbane, Wheel of Time has Roose Bolton, Rings of Power has young Ned Stark, and even House of the Dragons, a show that takes place in the same universe as Game of Thrones, has a former castmate in Hugh of the Vale. Now, I intend to talk about each of these shows in depth in the future, but for the purposes of this video, I will talk about each of them briefly and relate to how I think each of them fit into the race to be the next Game of Thrones. The Witcher was the first of these 4 shows to premiere, doing so in the very same year that Game of Thrones ended. It was the fastest out of the gate and saw some early successes with its first season. Before the show was released, there was some skepticism surrounding it, specifically around Henry Cavill's wig. However, the first season is generally well regarded, and Cavill in particular is a standout and, dare I say, absolutely perfect as Geralt. The first season still stands as one of Netflix's top 10 most watched shows, which is pretty impressive. Season 2 of The Witcher starts out with a great first episode, but as the season went on, I felt the quality slip and myself becoming disinterested in some of the storylines. The second season also just felt like it didn't have the same level of hype surrounding it as the first season did. It will be interesting to track the progress of the show, especially when considering some of the choices Netflix has been making recently. I also think releasing it in the binge format hurts its cultural staying power, as it robs it of weekly speculation. All in all, I don't think The Witcher is the next Game of Thrones. The Wheel of Time is based on Robert Jordan's book series of the same name. Well regarded in fantasy circles for years, The Wheel of Time feels like it was long overdue a true adaptation for its work. So when it was announced that Amazon was going to be adapting the series, I was excited. However, I will say that the show has been rather unlucky so far in its short run. The show had begun filming before the COVID pandemic had started and had to shut down in the middle of production. This no doubt caused some issues, as in the finale of the first season, certain scenes feel like they were limited because of time and resources. Another massive blow to the show was the departure of one of the main cast members. To make matters worse, the actor that left, Barney Harris, who plays Matt Cawthon, was a standout throughout the season. Having an actor change, especially for one of the show's leads, can be a deal breaker for a lot of people. Harris left midway through production, which forced the writers to make changes to the ending of the season. Something else that I think holds the show back is the adaptation style they chose to employ, as its adaptation style is very loose and the majority of the show, I would say, is different from the first book in the series. I think at this point it is safe to say that The Wheel of Time is not going to be the next Game of Thrones, especially considering that it is not even Amazon's main horse in this race. Amazon spared no expense when it comes to the Rings of Power, as it is the most expensive show in history. They went all in on this show, trying to capitalize on the fantasy vacuum Game of Thrones created and the popularity of the Lord of the Rings franchise. Trying to emphasize this connection to the Lord of the Rings is also why they gave it a weird clunky name, Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. As of the making of this video, Rings of Power isn't out yet, so I don't know how good or bad the show is. However, it is already proving itself to be a lightning rod, with tons of people excited for the show and just as many ready to tear it down. It does not directly pull from any of Tolkien's written works, allowing for the showrunners freer reign in telling the stories that they want to tell. This, in my opinion, is definitely a risk. Ultimately though, I'm just happy it didn't end up being the young Aragorn show that so many news articles speculated it being. Just based on the sheer scale of the show and the prestige that comes with Tolkien's name, I think there is a non-zero chance that Rings of Power could be the next Game of Thrones. However, it will all depend on the actual quality of the show itself. If the show proves its critics right in the first season, I could see it being written off by many, no matter how much money Amazon pumps into a second season. House of the Dragon has both a distinct advantage and disadvantage in the race. The disadvantage is that it is connected to Game of Thrones, and with people still reviling the ending of the show, I think some will not tune in because of the feelings the finale left them with. No matter how good the show is, some people still won't watch because they won't want to get invested again to be ultimately disappointed. HBO is banking on fans kind of forgetting about the ending to Game of Thrones.
I genuinely hope that audiences are open to watching a new chapter in the Game of Thrones saga.
The advantage that House of the Dragon has in the race is that it is connected to Game of Thrones, which was the biggest show of the last decade. Though some fans may refuse to return to Westeros, I would say the majority of fans are willing to see what House of the Dragon has to offer. People love Game of Thrones, and they want to love House of the Dragon, to get lost in fantastic storytelling like the early seasons of Thrones. The willingness for people to watch House of the Dragon was made apparent when the series premiered to 10 million people. House of the Dragon evokes the same feeling as Game of Thrones, a dark tone that is unique from the other shows in the race. Before the premiere, if you looked online, you would almost exclusively see people clowning on the show, but after the first 2 episodes, almost everyone is praising it, safe to clown on the wigs a little bit. This shows that at the end of the day, what really matters is the quality of the show and the story being told. I think House of the Dragon can be Game of Thrones' spiritual successor and have an absolutely fantastic run. With the ending to the story already written, I don't see how they can mess it up the same way that Thrones did in the finale. At this point in time, with the shows that are currently aired, I think House of the Dragon has the best shot to be the next Game of Thrones. As a fantasy fan, I love seeing so many fantasy shows springing up and adapting stories that I have long hoped would have a show or movie. In the end, it's us, the fans, who really win as we get to enjoy all of this fantasy content, even if it's not all great. There's a ton more fantasy adaptations on the way, like the Jon Snow spin-off that I don't really want but will probably watch anyway. And ultimately, if I had to back a horse in this race, my money for the next Game of Thrones is something written by Brandon Sanderson.
I would be surprised if we aren't on set doing things in this time next year. I would be shocked if we aren't. So there you are. That's where we are. Expect in the next few months some announcements that you might find exciting.
If you somehow got to the end of the video, I want to thank you for watching. Feel free to leave in the comments what your thoughts are on the shows discussed throughout this video, and what you think about the race to be the next Game of Thrones. Also, it would mean a lot if you liked and subscribed. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next video.